Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us to celebrate the International Day of the Tropics and help us launch the latest State of the Tropics report on the digital divide in the tropics. My name is Anne Penny, and I am the State of the Tropics Project Manager based at James Cook University, Nomabata campus in Cairns, Far North Queensland. I'd like to first acknowledge the Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first inhabitants of this country, pay my respects to the traditional owners and elders, past and present, of the land where our staff and students live, learn and work. In the spirit of reconciliation, I also acknowledge the valuable contribution that Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples continue to make to James Cook University and the broader community. I would also like to acknowledge Indigenous peoples from all around the world and the tropics in particular. The first land managers, scientists and linguists. It is such a thrill to be with you today and moderating this conversation. So before we learn about the digital divide, however, I'd like to ask Professor Harding, convener of the State of the Tropics, to offer a few words of welcome.
Thank you, Anne, and it's my great pleasure to be with you today and to warmly welcome each and every one of you to this very special day, this celebration of another International Day of the Tropics. Now, this day, this important UN-endorsed day, allows us to recognise that the countries and territories within the tropics share many unique challenges, but opportunities too, and they stem from much more than their historical or current political and economic circumstances. In 2019, which was the last time that the State of the Tropics Leadership Group met to discuss a way forward for this particular project, the impact of digital technology and the digital divide was considered an important focus for this project, for this particular thematic report. Now, I think you'd agree with me, the events of 2020 and 2021 have only served to highlight the critical nature of digital inequality. The technology that allows us to have this conversation is just not available or affordable for many in the tropics. And the report we're publishing today and our conversation will shine a spotlight on that digital divide, but also on the bright future that digital technologies can offer to the peoples of the tropics. I'm certainly looking forward to hearing from our diverse and really outstanding panelists on their take about digital technologies in the tropics. With that, allow me again to warmly welcome each and every one of you to today's webinar. Thank you, Anne.
Thank you so much, Sandra. Now, just before I introduce our distinguished panelists for our conversation this afternoon, I'd like to take this opportunity just to give you a very brief overview of what we have covered in this year's State of the Tropics Focus Report. I'm sure, as many of you know, we try to celebrate the International Day with a special event and hopefully relevant report. If you're interested in anything else we've done and haven't seen it before, please, all of our products are available on our website. So the State of the Tropics project itself, make sure this works, there we go. So it's overseen by an amazing leadership group that comes from all throughout the world, actually. All of these institutions are either in the tropics or work extensively in the tropics. So I just wanted to share those with you and once again express our gratitude for their involvement in this project over the last 10 years. So now the report itself, as Sandra mentioned, it became more important than ever in 2020 to understand digital inequality. So what we did, we had a look at what data was available. Interestingly, for, I guess, a project that is all about data, and there isn't that much available on how we use technology, who uses technology, etc. But we did our best. So it takes stock on the current and historical status of information and communication technology and digital access across different regions of the tropics. So the report covers access to technology such as mobile phones, the internet, education, whether schools have access to the internet, students have access to the internet and how it is taught, digital literacy, and also the production, trade, use and disposal of digital technologies and the physical devices. The report also includes 4 case studies that look in detail about ICT in the Pacific, one on digital health technologies, mobile money, and a little look at some of the resources used to create digital devices in a story on cobalt mining in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So just some headline statistics to start us off. These data are largely from 2019 and 20, but globally, we look at about 108 mobile phone subscriptions per 100 people. So there are more active mobile phone subscriptions in the world than there are people. In the tropics, our estimates have it a little bit lower at 97 per 100. So even though it's a bit lower, I think it needs to be noted that in the year 2000, which is when I got my first mobile phone, there were less than 5 per 100 people in the tropics. In 2019, just over 50% of the global population used the internet in a meaningful way. Our estimates put the tropics at just over 37%, but bear in mind that ranges from tropical countries from very, very low to close to zero in some places, up to 100% in others. We're in a situation where technology increasing in mobile broadband and satellite technology are driving connectivity. So expect connectivity to be inevitable, but there are costs and other barriers remaining. So just a little slide here on education. Where the data exists, most schools in the tropics do not have access to ICT and the internet, particularly in Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Central America. And most students, so this is, in most students, this is the latest available, I suppose, data from UNESCO here on the left, which is students and youths who have access to the internet at home. You can see in some places it is quite high, but a lot of places in the tropics it remains quite low. However, ICT is increasing. ICT is increasingly included in school curriculums. So when we did a little scope about which countries include ICT in the curriculums, we actually found that most tropical countries do include teaching ICT into the curriculum by certainly mid to late high school. So although digital literacy lags in the tropics, it is increasing. Quickly on production and trade, interesting, almost 40% of all ICT products are exported from the tropics. That is actually dominated obviously by the Pearl River Delta manufacturing area in China and Hong Kong, but increasingly Thailand, Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, also Mexico and Costa Rica, increasingly contributing to that global value chain of communication technology. In terms of how people use the internet, we know almost a quarter of all people worldwide use the internet to purchase something. In 2019, I suspect that number probably increased in 2020. It was less than 10% in the tropics, however. Just the last important thing I wanted to note, and that refers to the map there on the right, that looks at the kilograms of e-waste we generate per capita. It is the fastest growing form of waste globally. And the vast majority of it comes from North America, Europe, China, Japan, but something like 82% of it is processed in Brazil, in Nigeria, in Ghana, in India. So wealthy countries are once again outsourcing their waste, their footprints to tropical nations to process that, sometimes in quite dangerous conditions for both human health and the environment. So just to finish off, because it's more interesting to talk to our panelists, universal access is probably inevitable, but the time frame matters, and as long as that gap persists, inequality could be exacerbated. The utility of communications technology often depends on the social, cultural, and environmental context in which it operates, and I think we'll probably pick that apart a little bit more in the panel. But generally, the report tells us that a digital future can be a bright future for the tropics if the right conditions are in place. So on that note, I have a great pleasure in introducing our panel. So I'd like to now ask our panelists to turn on their video and audio, please, so we can introduce them properly. And I can stop sharing my screen and put you all on view so we can see you. So today we're going to explore the digital divide in the tropics with a particular focus on the Asia Pacific, a region of the world which includes some of the most technologically advanced communities and some that are the least connected in the world. So I'll introduce our panel. We have this afternoon on Andrea Della Mattia is the president of Microsoft Asia Pacific, where she leads Microsoft's overall business, accelerating the digital transformation journeys of Microsoft's customers and partners and driving the company's mission of empowering every person and every organisation on the planet to achieve more. A distinguished alumna of James Cook University, she also resides on JCU Singapore's advisory board. She's passionate about helping customers and partners leverage technology to drive business outcomes and believes that when we are inclusive, everybody wins. It is such an honour to have you here with us this afternoon, Andrea.
Thank you. Very pleased to be here.
Next, Professor Ian Atkinson is a tropical leader and director of the E-Research Centre at James Cook University. His PhD studies were in chemical physics, but nearly 20 years ago, he moved from experimental science into computational chemistry and high-performance computing. He has a long-standing interest in e-research methods, tools, scientific data management, and user interfaces for HPC tools. He's actively involved in researching how new systems and software that connect the physical and the virtual world, particularly focusing on environmental monitoring and sensor networks. Thanks so much for joining us, Ian.
Absolute pleasure. I'm delighted to be here, Anne. Thank you.
And coming from last but not least, definitely, coming from one of the State of the Tropics founding partner institutions, and also from yesterday, it is still Monday in Hawaii, Associate Professor Tarcissius Kulaka is the Director of the Centre for Pacific Island Studies at the University of Hawaii, Manoa. He's an expert on the politics of the Pacific Islands with a particular focus on the Solomon Islands and international intervention in the region. Tarcissius studied at the University of South Pacific and Australian National University. There is very little he doesn't know about one of the most sparsely populated but strategically important parts of the tropics. Welcome, Tarcissius.
Thank you for having me. It's an honour.
Oh, hang on, I've lost my page. Here we go. So for most of us, modern communication technologies are something that have only become available within our lifetime. As I mentioned, I got my first mobile phone in the year 2000. I couldn't actually afford to make any phone calls with it, but I had a phone. I'm really interested in our panel's first experience with modern communication technology. So Ian, I'd like to start with you, if I could. You've obviously been involved in technology for a long time. When did you first encounter modern communication technologies? I'm going to assume you were a fairly early adopter.
Yes, thank you, Anne, and thank you again for the opportunity, and Professor Harding for inviting me. So yeah, I was an early adopter. I had to think about this. I wasn't contemporaneous with the invention of the internet in 1969, but almost. But I actually used very early internets actually when I was at high school to connect to a local computer, which was really interesting. That was over phone lines. But I really used the internet proper really very shortly after it started and got up and running in Australia. So I think that was in around about 1986 as a PhD student. And it was incredibly slow. I mean, you think of dial-up modems, it was like a fraction of that speed. And if you wanted to download an email message, you'd go away and have a cup of coffee and come back and there'd be half a page on the screen. But it was amazing because you had this direct contact to people across the world that you just, otherwise it was just simply impossible at the time. It was just impossible to do anything at that speed. And I do remember about 1985, I came to James Cook University. I set up what I think was the first website at James Cook. That was really and that was probably 1995, something like that. Maybe a little earlier. So it was very slow, but of course it grew quickly. And I guess that's the story that we're going to be talking about today.
Absolutely. Thanks, Ian. It's amazing to think about how fast this has changed. It's mind-boggling. Andrea, I'm sure you also had technology in your life from a young age. Can you describe when you sort of first connected and what drove you to include computer science with your engineering studies?
So, and I was about 21 when I graduated from James Cook University with a Bachelor of Engineering. And look, back then, it was sometime in the 90s. I must admit, I didn't imagine a career in tech. And if you would have asked a young graduate, I would have said I was actually going to pursue engineering law. However, early on in my career, I had the opportunity to interview with a young entrepreneur who was starting a tech company. And in hindsight, look, obviously joining that organization was one of the best decisions I made. But again, back then, the world was very different. And I heard you touch on mobile phones. I guess for me, my first brush with the future was when I had the opportunity to have my first mobile phone. It was actually a car phone, which seemed incredibly futuristic at the time. And so this would have been about maybe 1993, 94. And look, truth be told, it was more like a big black brick, but it was really a sign of things to come. Not so mobile, and it definitely cost a lot to make calls.
Absolutely. Well, I'm sure that's a lot earlier than a lot of us, certainly a lot earlier than me coming from rural Queensland. Tarcissius, you come from the Solomon Islands, so your experiences with communication technology are likely to be far more representative of the broader tropics. What was your first experience with modern communication technology such as mobile phones or the internet? Has it changed much where you're from?
So I was born and grew up in a place called the Weather Coast of Guadalcanal, which is relatively isolated, or at least other people think it's isolated. Those of us who come from there don't think that it's isolated. And so I never saw a car until I was 12 years old, let alone mobile phones and things. And the reason was I went across to the other side of the island to go to school. That's when I saw a car. We still don't have cars where I come from nowadays. We have a few tractors, but things haven't changed much. The amazing thing is that a lot of people now have mobile phones where I come from. And so we've kind of jumped the technology gap over the years. My experience with communication technology, not modern communication technology, but communication, was those two-way radios that we used to have at the government stations where you would call the government officials. And I thought that was amazing. I never had a mobile phone until I came to Hawaii. And that was in 2003. They had them when I was living in Fiji, but it never caught on. I never had one. My first experience with email was as a graduate student at University of the South Pacific. I went to New Zealand, and it was in Christchurch. And we were all taken up to this room where somebody used the internet to send an email downstairs to another person downstairs. And we were all amazed. And so I thought that was fascinating. Now it's something that we use all the time.
Wow. Well, it's extraordinary, isn't it, how fast we come. We're a place where mobile phones jump over cars in terms of technology. Absolutely extraordinary. Ian, I'd like to come back to you now on that line, actually. You've been watching, technology advance over many years, having made the first website at JCU, and have seen how communities use technology when it becomes available to them. That is, I guess, when the divide is closed. I was wondering if you could talk about some of your experience about how people and communities have used technology and whether the benefits or outcomes were what was expected.
Yeah, thanks, Anne. So I can't quite match Tarcissius in the car story, but remote Australia, rural Australia, it has actually been vastly underserved with communications technology, not dissimilar to the Pacific in many ways. And it's just simply geography and population density and the expense required. And so there's been lots of attempts and lots of lobbying for these communities to get the internet, and it's never quite worked. So about a decade ago, Australia's national broadband network was erected, and part of the solution for remote communities was a few big satellites, geostationary satellites. Terrific. Didn't quite do what people expected, but they did come online. Now, what's been really interesting to me about that was I started working in a research sense to understand how people could use this for agriculture and for business, and to try and do better on their land, to run their businesses better in these remote locations, because the world was accelerating on this digital pathway. People didn't have access to it. They wanted access, they got access. And so what surprised us in that research was that it wasn't an immediate, well, we're going to wire up our farms and make them internet centric, or we're going to bring these amazing tools and services on board. People actually wanted to do Netflix, or they wanted to very much do education and get kids being educated at home. And so we really had to go and rethink all the things we were thinking, because we just simply got it wrong. And I think this is quite common when you look around regions of the world where they have technology jumps, and we've seen this in Africa, and we see this in the Pacific and lots of Southeast Asia, where there's no fixed phones, people go straight to mobile phones. Wide internet may just be completely missed out, and people are now using 4G. If they're fortunate, maybe 5G will come along, and there'll be some technology leaps. But what people do with it isn't what you expect. And I think there are some really interesting, amazing cases where people are just doing incredibly creative things with technology. But equally, there are plenty of cases where it's almost like a new culture comes to town. It's almost like a new imperialism where, corporations come in, they can get into people's pockets and phones, they can cost them a lot of money, and they can actually promote some quite negative outcomes in communities. So I think we need to be really holistic in our understanding of the benefits of technology, and we will go down this pathway. It's unstoppable, people want it and need it. But preparation for it, not that you can predict the future, but to at least anticipate some of the negative outcomes as well as the positive ones, so that we can guide it and get the best value and promote the best possible outcomes. Yeah.
Thanks, Ian. That's marvelous. And that actually really sort of leads towards my next question, which is for Andrea. Sort of, what you were talking about, being prepared for, having the knowledge to use it appropriately. So, I mean, that kind of falls a little bit under the umbrella of what we call digital literacy. Mm-hmm. And it is definitely one of the barriers to closing that digital divide. So, even when the technology is available, people aren't necessarily using it the right way or in any way at all. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of digital literacy and how we might be able to overcome this barrier?
And absolutely, Ian's right. We do need to be prepared and help others be prepared. And with the world becoming a computer, and as the report indicates, the digital revolution has transformed lives. We're seeing that every aspect of our daily life, work, and society are being transformed by tech. So to work in this connected future, we need talent with digital skills and literacy. But the reality is, as we're seeing these tech advances, some of the roles and activities that exist today may not exist in the future. And when you look back and, you reflect upon every industrial revolution, in the past, we've experienced humanity learning new skills to contribute better to the new economy at that point in time. And that's exactly what we're seeing today. So this move to cloud and AI needs people who can develop and people who can code. And that's why digital and STEM skills are becoming even more important. And not just for kids in school or at university, but for those of us as well, right? Early in career or mid-career as well. But we're also seeing that more than ever, tech is becoming more of a multidisciplinary sport. So when you look at where tech is going, everyone who majors in computer science or data science should also consider taking courses in liberal arts, for example. And anyone who's studying liberal arts really needs to think about and have some exposure to computer science, to data science, to statistics and the like. However, we really need to recognize that the teams that are going to do the best work, who are really going to solve some of the world's greatest problems using tech, they're almost always going to be these multidisciplinary teams and people coming from different functions and different backgrounds. So it's not about everyone needing to be qualified in IT, but it is becoming more important that everyone has some level of basic digital skills or computer science education, because this helps develop fundamental skills that are going to be important primarily for jobs in the future. And when you look at where we are today, as we're starting to see economies reopen and recover, you know, it's no secret that the types of jobs required post-COVID have evolved very quickly. And, you know, the report shows the pandemic has put the role that tech plays in our lives, you know, really front and center. So it's our responsibility as leaders to equip the region, you know, with the right digital skills. And I heard an interesting fact just recently. Over the past couple of years, the number of developers at non-tech companies has grown faster than at tech companies. And the automotive industry is a great example. There were more software engineers than mechanical engineers hired over the last year. So the real question is, how can tech create more opportunities, not just for a few, but really for all? And that's where education and digital literacy really remains, you know, one of the most pressing societal challenges, and potentially a great equalizer. So let me leave you with three opportunities. We're going to think about how our teachers and our educators are trained so they can be more effective. We also want to think about how we can move away from static learning to learning everywhere, cloud-based, app-based, you know, video-based. But also we want to think about the role that gamification can play. You know, take an app like Minecraft, which is this open world game that promotes creativity and collaboration and problem solving in an immersive environment. So, you know, needless to say, digital literacy is front and center today more than ever.
Thank you so much. That is a lot to think about. And it is, I think it's really what you're saying too is not just, I guess, multidisciplinary teams, but also people from all experiences in life as well, all, you know, from all over the world as well, to get those different experiences. I'd like to now come to Tarcissius. So the Pacific is the region in the world with the lowest mobile phone and internet access rates in the world. I just wonder if you could, I guess, describe for us what it is about Pacific countries that makes connectivity so difficult, and also what you think some of the impact of growing connectivity will be in the region, both inside and out.
Thank you. But before I answer that question, let me go back to some of the issues that were raised earlier on. I think preparing communities to embrace this new technology is really, really important. And in terms of the Pacific Islands, for instance, what the internet has done, well, the intention initially was that if you provide people with access to internet, it would result in economic development, that something will happen, people will be able to improve their livelihood. What I've noticed in a lot of Pacific Island places is that the internet has merely globalized the village. And so people use the internet to talk about things that are happening in the village, to create relationships with other Pacific Islanders that are living overseas, like myself. Today, I sat here, right here, and sent money home to Western Union on my computer. And so that links me to the village and ensures that I participate in things that are happening at home. And therefore, I keep my relationship with people at home. And increasingly, a lot of Pacific Islanders are living in places like the West Coast of the US or Sydney or New Zealand. And that link to the village is a really important one. And so which raises another issue of creating culturally appropriate technology, or using technology for purposes of reproducing cultural traditions that we would otherwise do it face to face. And thinking about how that's used for that purpose is important. Now let me go to your question. So for the Pacific Islands, as we know and our audience know, the Pacific is huge. Oceania covers a third of our planet's surface area, and therefore it's geographically dispersed and sparsely populated. And because of that, providing the technology to every Pacific Islander out there becomes very expensive. The economies of scale are not there. And so you will find that access to the internet is available in the major urban centers like Suva or Apia or Honiara or Port Moresby. But as soon as you go out into the rural areas, or you go out into the outer islands of, say, the Federated States of Micronesia, accessibility is reduced and it becomes really, really expensive as well. And so it's not only accessibility in terms of, so accessibility is increasing rapidly because the service providers are putting up mobile phones all over the country, but it's very expensive for most people. And therefore, that reduces the ability to use the technology for some of the things that we think they would use. One of the things, and I'll talk about this more later, is that one of the drivers of having access to internet in the Pacific, I don't think it's profitability, because most of the companies will not make profit in the Pacific. But one of the biggest drivers nowadays is geopolitical competition, that they are creating accessibility because they compete to have control over the Pacific Islands region. So I'll stop here for now.
Thank you so much. I love that idea you talked about of the internet allowing this global village that allows you to connect back to culture and how we might continue to promote that, because that is obviously a really important role that all kinds of communications play. So thank you very much for that. I'll just go back to Ian for, I guess, a little bit more of a technical question, if you like, but digital technologies, as we've talked about, finding their way to every aspect of people's lives, including trade, finances, and education. So things like the Internet of Things, digital currencies, blockchain, they're all new concepts for the world and, particularly for the tropics. I mean, you sort of think about these sorts of things. I wonder if you had any thoughts on, whether these kind of technologies can help improve livelihoods and well-being for sort of underserved communities in the tropics.
Yeah, thanks, Anne. So actually, I might just go back to something Tarcissius said, because I think it was a really strong and important point that it's really to do with the cultural appropriateness of some technologies. And as Tarcissius said, it's not a big market. Big firms aren't going to come in and strip mine money out of it, and advertising revenues are not going to be massive. So that kind of means that you're in some ways a bit on the trailing edge. But of course, as you say, there's geopolitics that comes into it too. But I think it's very important to think of that, and I have had some experience in the Indigenous Australian context, and there was certainly a lot of work that Nokia, that early mobile phone company that kind of is no longer with us really in the form that it was, spent a lot of money in the early days of mobile phones in Southern Africa trying to understand how people used their products and trying to design services that people would use. And every time they did it, people would find some other creative way to use that product or service. It was really quite something to see. And product things like M-Pesa that you talk about in your report, Anne, are just really quite brilliant low-tech approaches to digital money. So I'd really like to think that some of the communities which are now going to be gaining, I think in the next couple of years, very high bandwidth connectivity through different services, can actually try and capture some of the value of this themselves. So rather than they being the product and being monetized from the data that they sell, and maybe the cultural information and so forth that activity embodies, maybe that can be, there can be some more sovereignty around that. Now that will be very difficult, but I think it's a really interesting challenge that we might want to think about. So I think though, and as you've asked, there are a whole suite of new technologies that are just washing over the world. And cryptocurrencies, blockchains, Internet of Things, the fourth industrial revolution, sensor networks, these might seem exotic if you don't use them, but they are really actually quite ambient now. They're really connecting us in ways that we don't even know, and they can be tremendous. You know, I know of some great Internet of Things projects, which is just basically connecting every object that you have. It just talks over some kind of network to the internet and goes up into some cloud, and some data scientist uses that for some value and may project information back down to you. And there's lots of reasons in cyclone prone regions with climate change to get better use of natural resources, to be better use of or to reduce environmental impacts, that these technologies will be run out and they'll be applied, and very good things will come from them. But it does require a skill base and an understanding, and there are costs to them, and we have to be careful about not rushing too far ahead so that we buy the wrong technologies and we get then unfortunate results, and it puts us off. But I think where the Pacific will have some interesting challenges because of skills, because of justice leapfrog is in digital and cryptocurrencies. Now, whatever cryptocurrencies will become, and how that evolves, digital money is definitely the future. It's the only future. And that provides a great opportunity, but again, we have to work out how to do it. Blockchain, I think, is a really interesting technology, and so do lots of people, of course. It's a way to capture value. I think of it simply that, you know, if you understand the provenance of a good or a service, who produced it, where they produced it, how they produced it, what went into it, that actually creates, it's more than just a supply chain piece of data. That can be used to sell your story, to connect you to the world in different ways, to expose yourself and provide great understanding. And it also creates value. You know, a product that's genuinely from a small community that has a story around it can actually be quite valuable. So I think it's going to open up ways for people to economically boost what they're doing and earn more value out of some of their own activities. And also with that, and I talked about sovereignty before, create that connection and create that sort of sovereign, if you like, stamp of authenticity about what they do. So all this is great. How it's implemented, I think, is going to be really interesting, because it's such a big shift. It's such a big challenge and change in how we're doing things. But from the example I gave in Southern Africa before with M-Pesa and so forth, people are super creative. And I think it's just informing them and educating them in just the right way, and people will find amazing solutions that we've not thought of through this. It'll be quite different to, you know, maybe the sort of dominant Western corporations and how they think it'll work. I'm sure that there'll be some brilliant new ideas will emerge from these communities, and if they can grab them and keep hold of them, it'll create new value for people. So this is a really very interesting time, but it'll have to be supported by the right technology. And I think this is a great opportunity to maybe recruit new people to regions, actually. You know, it's a very saturated startup world in a lot of the Western countries. I think there's actually a new field, really, of different ideas and different ways of thinking about the internet, different ways to use communications that will open up to us if we're wise enough to try and walk in partnership with people rather than just impose something on them. Yeah.
Thanks, Ian. I think you're absolutely right. And it'll be really interesting to watch the role of private companies versus the state versus individual in that space moving forward. Andrew, I think that actually leads on to a question I have for you, which is, you know, in the right circumstances that Ian was talking about, technology can provide immense opportunities for communities and businesses. I'm wondering if you knew of some examples actually of innovations occurring in the Asia Pacific in this space.
You know, Anne, when I look across APAC, you know, you see this incredible pool of talent, you know, people who are hungry to do something impactful for their communities and people who really have an innovation mindset. And when I look back and reflect upon the last year, and let's face it, so many of our markets were in the thick of the pandemic, and many still are in the thick of the pandemic. The growth mindset that really stands out for me is the Parliament of the Maldives. I think, as Ian said, it's interesting how people find other creative ways to use tech. So imagine this. This is the Parliament of Maldives, who for the first time in history conducted their parliamentary sessions online. Now, who would have imagined that, you know, a year and a half, 2 years ago, that we would have had virtual online sessions? Similarly, in Sri Lanka, another great example, we saw the 150-year-old tea industry move from having weekly in-person tea auctions to virtual auctions. Now, what an amazing way to use tech, but that in turn actually saved 2 million jobs. And think about that in turn, then supporting families for people who are in these jobs. And a couple other examples that, you know, with companies you may be familiar with. Grab and Bukalapak, pretty well known. They're two of the largest unicorns across Asia Pacific. And we're working with them to help digitally skill their driver partners and their employees, which in turn gives them the opportunity to empower more than 12 million micro, small, and medium enterprises. And that in turn gives the opportunity to help empower and enable 100 million customers in Indonesia, for example, to move to e-com. So this is when you see that compound effect that technology can have. And then when you think about the incredible startups and developers that are around the Asia Pacific region, I have to say some of the hackathons that we organize regularly are some of my favorite moments. At the last AI for Accessibility hackathon that we had in APAC, we actually had more than 400 participants across 8 countries come together to conceptualize and prototype AI solutions that have the opportunity to transform the daily lives of people with disabilities. So think about the impact we can have to support an accessible recovery, not just a financial recovery. So they're just a couple ways I'm seeing some real innovation for how people are using tech to be able to also support the communities and the societies around us.
Thanks so much. They sound incredible. I'll have to find out more about those things. Tarcissius, I'd like to come back to, you know, something you touched on earlier. So the biggest drivers of increasing connectivity in the Pacific, and I think Ian, you mentioned this as well, have been private companies such as Digicel, Vodafone, B-Mobile. Currently, Digicel may be looking to sell its Pacific assets. I was wondering if you might be able to comment on the politics of communication assets in the Pacific and why is that important?
Okay, thank you. Before I do that, let me go back to some of the issues that Jan and Andrea raised and you know, what the technology has enabled us to do. So the University of the South Pacific is owned by 12 Pacific Island countries. And they have an extension program that's been around for a very long time, since the 80s, when I was an undergrad student there. But it was mostly audio. Now they're using this technology to provide education for students in 12 Pacific Island countries, which they would not have otherwise been able to do. And then those of us teaching at universities will know that in the last 1 year, this technology has become really, really important for us. I never knew what a Zoom was until COVID-19 came, and we scrambled to learn the technology. So it's not only students. I think the students knew more about the technology than the professors, or at least for me. And we all had to learn, how do you deliver learning, teaching and learning through Zoom or through the internet? And we're not trained to do that. And so we have to quickly learn how to do it. The technology has also, in the case of Pacific Islands in the last 1 year, enabled us to have communications across the Pacific on COVID-19 and other issues because we can't meet in person. And so we have regular Zoom discussions that includes people from Aotearoa, Australia, and all the Pacific Island countries. Not only that, we also use the technology to have what we call kava Zoom. And so we get together and drink kava on Zoom. And it's not necessarily just to get intoxicated with kava, but also to tell stories and talk about issues that are important to the Pacific. So it's connected us in huge ways. In terms of the politics, so increasingly Pacific Islanders, like people elsewhere in the world, are using the internet technology to participate in political discussions. So take, for instance, the elections in Samoa. A lot of Samoans live in the diaspora in New Zealand or Australia and here in the US. And it enabled them to participate, but also to influence the outcomes of the election. Of course, there is an ongoing constitutional crisis in Samoa at the moment, but a lot of people are participating in that discussion. We've seen it in other Pacific Island countries, but there have also been pushback by governments. In Fiji, for instance, after the 2006 coup, there were discussions about trying to shut down some of the social media groups. In the Solomons, they were going to shut down Facebook last year. There were discussions by the government to do that. I think they didn't do it because they couldn't figure out how to do it. But they were talking about doing it. At the international level, and I mentioned geopolitical competition earlier on, I think the Pacific Islands, as we all know, has become the center of this geopolitical competition between the US and its allies on one hand and China on the other, similar to what we had during the Cold War period. But nowadays, it's no longer about shutting down a satellite tracking station by the USSR in Kiribati. It's the technology is at the middle of it. In 2019, Australia offered to construct the undersea cable from Sydney to Solomon Islands and to Papua New Guinea after Huawei offered to do it. They were going to sign a contract with them. And increasingly here in the US, people are really conscious about that. Just earlier this month, for instance, the US government passed the Innovation and Competition Act, which will allocate $250 billion to try and counter China's technological ambitions globally. I'm not sure whether $250 billion is enough. There are other acts that are being proposed. One is called the Blue Pacific Act, proposed by Hawaiian Representative Ed Case, the Honoring Oceania Act. So the Pacific Islands has become the center of a lot of this competition and discussions that are taking place, at least here in the US, and I'm sure to a certain extent in Australia as well.
Thank you, Tarcissius. And of course, communication technologies at the center of all of those discussions. It's incredible. Now, you mentioned this a little bit earlier, Andrea, about technology and equality. We heard a little bit from Tarcissius about some of the ways that that's happening through the Pacific as well. So the head of the United Nations actually described communication technology as the great equalizer of our time. Do you think technology can help underserved communities? I know you did mention women and those living with disability before. I wonder if you could possibly elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, and absolutely. And again, first, let me acknowledge the challenging times we live in. Unfortunately, it's a terrible fact that men are overrepresented among the fatalities of the virus, but women are disproportionately affected by the social and economic consequences. And as the report indicates, the pandemic has revealed inequalities that frankly have existed for many years, but the crisis has really brought them into sharp focus. There's a report from BCG that shows those at a higher risk of infection from COVID are lower income earners, and women and young people, minorities, and lower skilled workers have also been disproportionately affected by job and income loss. And then when you think about on top of that, 10 million girls in low and middle income countries will drop out of secondary education, due to the pandemic. So in addition to being laid off at higher rates than male counterparts during the pandemic, we also see women are considering downshifting their careers or leaving the workforce altogether at staggering rates. And I think it's fair to say we've all seen how the boundaries between work and family and home have been blurred. And the mental stress of worrying about family's health and finances, whilst trying to meet expectations of work, that's taking a toll on workers everywhere. But when women are the financial controllers of the home and their economic power is diminished, well, then we see an impact on the world economy, and it's immediate. So when we think about how economies can respond and recover, it's crucial that women empowerment is mainstreamed, and that their role in the economy needs to be across industry, because it can't be an afterthought and it can't be just a tick box. And we've all seen how tech is changing the way we work and learn, and the pandemic has highlighted this widening skills gap. Tarcissius touched on the need for educators as well to learn how to use tech to teach. Well, this skills gap needs to be closed with great urgency, and that's where public and private organizations really do need to step up. Last year, we launched a global skills initiative to reach 25 million people worldwide. And I'm humbled to say, 9 months later, we've actually helped more than 30 million people to build new digital skills. But you also have to consider, as I touched on earlier, there are more than 1 billion people with disabilities around the world. And in Asia, that's nearly 650 million people. And women within this group are significantly marginalized. So we need to be intentional in our outreach with the power of our organizations and our influence to ensure that they have access to skills, to tech, and the support to earn and to contribute. So what's needed for tech to support women? It goes beyond the device itself. And it includes policy, and it includes support and resources for sustainable and flexible and frankly, empathetic work environments, especially for parents and also for caregivers. So just even speaking about our organization, our mission is deeply inclusive, and it's to empower every person and every organization on the planet to achieve more. But it comes from a fundamental belief that if the world does well, we'll all do well. And that's one of the reasons why we launched the Microsoft Enabler program. You might be able to see it with my background I have here, with business partners and some nonprofits all across Asia Pacific, working together to improve the employability of people with disabilities in the region. Because ultimately, we all have a responsibility to step up and to help underserved communities and minorities and those living with disabilities.
Thank you so much for that, Andrea. That program sounds amazing. What I might do, due to time, we'll go to our final question for all the panelists about, I guess, looking to the future. We have been very future focused for this conversation because we're talking about technology. But I guess I'm just after your final thoughts today on how do we get that? How do we get this right? We know connectivity is inevitable. There are satellites coming, there is 5G coming, everybody's going to have a mobile phone, everybody's going to have the internet eventually. So how do we make sure that digital technology makes life better? And I'll start with you, Ian, if you're ready to answer that question.
Yeah, it's a really big question, Anne. And look, I think that technology, as we all would, is not gifted with human characteristics. It's like a virus. It's just a thing. We have to actually take responsibility of technology. And I think it's actually, so it's an education piece, But it's not just educating people about the device. And I mean, I still marvel that the phone that is in my hand is faster than $1 million supercomputer that I helped buy 20 years ago. So these are inevitable, as you say, shifts or changes. I think we need to teach people not just technology, and Andrea talked about it earlier, a bit of liberal arts, actually a little bit of philosophy, a little bit of history, and so people can take agency of it. It's very easy to give in to technology, but I think we need to educate people about how to empower themselves with the technology so that it becomes a tool for their betterment, and rather than a slave or something that actually robs them of things. And it's, you know, it's very easy for kids, for adults, for everyone to lose some of themselves in technology. So I think some more purposeful thinking about that, which is going to be different everywhere in different cultures. And I think that'd be a great thing. I think that would actually set us up for a terrific future with technology in the supporting role to improve humanity and life in the Pacific.
Thank you, Ian. Andrea, what would be your answer to that question? How do we make life better?
Yeah, I think in addition to what we've touched on already, look, we all have a responsibility to protect our most finite resource, and that's the planet. And without an immediate and, you know, drastic action today, adapting to these impacts in the future will just be more difficult. It'll be more costly. So governments really need to realize how sustainability and revitalizing economies can actually go hand in hand, and to lead the charge in this arena, setting the right policies, regulation, and investments in driving a green economy, you know, infrastructure and skilling. But equally, I feel it's our role as leaders, working together as a coalition, if you will, to bring our strengths, our assets, and our resources to bear, which allows us to partner and to build a region that's more resilient, equitable, and frankly, sustainable and inclusive for everyone. So that's what we call purpose-driven tech, where the mission is to collaborate for the greater common good.
Thank you so much, Andrea. Now, I'd like to ask you, Tarcissius, what are your thoughts on this to finish us off today?
Thank you. I agree with Jan and Andrea that, you know, one of the biggest things, and I can speak for well, not for the entire Pacific, but my experiences of the Pacific Islands region, is preparing communities for these technologies. They're here already, and it's going to be accessible, more accessible in the future. And so providing communities, I'm not sure training is the right word, but preparing them to enable them to, like what Jan said earlier on, to creatively use the technology to enhance their livelihood. And for me, one of the things is, how do we use this technology to reproduce Pacific Island cultures, languages, and so forth. English is my fourth language. But if you look at the internet and the communications that people have nowadays, it's predominantly in English. And people immediately connect the internet to English rather than to the other languages that they have. So preparing communities for this, I think, is important.
Thank you so much. Well, we might end there. Thank you so much. It's clear from this discussion that closing the digital divide will provide huge benefits, but it's far more than just infrastructure or connectivity, isn't it? For it to be truly effective, we really need to focus on those external drivers that we're talking about: education, equality, political stability, and even language, as you mentioned, Tarcissius. So I'll finish us off there. Thank you so much for everyone around the world. I can see there's an amazing bunch of comments next to us from people all over the world who tuned in today. So I really appreciate it. For those who might know someone who missed out, it will be available online tomorrow, and I will ensure that's on our website. I'd particularly like to thank our panelists, Andrea Della Mattia, Ian Atkinson, and Tarcissius Kulaka, for joining us today. Thank you also to Professor Harding, the convener of the State of the Tropics project, and of course anyone who's provided contributions, advice and reviews for the State of the Tropics over the years, and particularly those who have assisted in getting this report done. Next year, We will hope to provide you on an update on the 2020 Broad Brush State of the Tropics report as we sort of seek to, I guess, start to understand the true impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the tropics. It'll be our first step there. So the past year has been a challenging one for so many, and we know that there are many more challenges ahead of us. So on behalf of the State of the Tropics Leadership Group, we wish you all the best as we all sort of work together, I guess, to recover and continue to build a sustainable future for the tropics. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.